Today we are examining the great masquerader, acute myocarditis.
Right. It can look like viral pleurisy. It can absolutely mimic acute coronary syndromes, but let's be clear, it's a lethal event.
We're looking at rapid necrosis.
And permanent structural remodeling. This is not some, transient irritation.
What's the clinical definition?
It's a sudden onset inflammatory injury of the myocardium. The key features are myocyte infection and necrosis.
And is it ischemic?
No, it's non-ischemic. The myocardial damage happens in the absence of obstructive coronary artery disease.
Okay, so we need to separate the presentations right away. There's acute and then there's fulminant. How do you define fulminant?
Well, fulminant myocarditis is the critical subtype. It's really distinguished by severe left ventricular systolic dysfunction and hemodynamic instability.
Which demands immediate intervention.
Exactly. It necessitates inotropes or, even mechanical circulatory support.
Give me the global incidence.
You're looking at about 4 to 14 cases per 100,000 people annually.
That sounds rare, but the mortality numbers tell a completely different story. What's the baseline for the non-fulminant cases?
It's about 1 to 7%.
Okay, now compare that to the histopathology that really keeps cardiologists up at night. Which type is the most dangerous?
That would be giant cell myocarditis.
And the mortality rate there is it's shocking.
It's staggering. We're talking a 62.5% rate of death or heart transplantation within 60 days of presentation.
62.5% in 2 months. That is incredibly aggressive. How does that stack up against, say, the lymphocytic and eosinophilic forms?
Well, combined, those forms carry a mortality or transplant rate of about 21 to 26%.
So still very high, but giant cell is, statistically, it's in a league of its own.
It absolutely is, and it forces a completely different speed of decision-making.
Let's talk about the drivers. Let's start with the infectious triggers in developed nations.
So viral is the most common cause. Things like Coxsackie virus, adenovirus, influenza, coronavirus, and parvovirus B19.
And what about bacterial?
The one to really know is Borrelia burgdorferi, so Lyme disease.
Okay, now shift the geography. If we're looking globally, the leading cause changes, right?
It does. It becomes parasitic, specifically Trypanosoma cruzi.
Chagas disease.
And Toxoplasma is another one on the radar.
Oncology is changing the landscape here, too. What are we seeing with, say, toxic or drug-induced causes?
Immune checkpoint inhibitor.
Right. These are life-saving drugs for cancer, but they can come with a serious cardiac cost.
They are a rising cause of severe and often fulminant cases.
And vaccines. We have to mention the COVID-19 connection.
Yes, there's a known association, specifically with the messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines.
So we know the causes. Now we need to know how to spot it. Why do we call it the great masquerader?
Because it lacks a pathognomonic clinical sign. It mimics other syndromes almost perfectly.
Okay, break down the symptom spectrum for us. What's number one?
Chest pain, 82 to 95% of cases.
Which immediately gets you thinking about an acute coronary syndrome protocol.
Exactly. Or pericarditis.
Number two.
Dyspnea. That's in about 19 to 49% of patients. It reflects pulmonary congestion.
And number three.
Syncope, 5 to 7%.
And that syncope is really the warning shot.
That is. It signals significant electrical instability, likely an arrhythmic origin.
This is where bedside skills become so important. There's a specific heart rate indicator that serves as a real red flag.
Yes. Tachycardia that's out of proportion to the fever.
That is such a critical distinction. Can you walk through the logic?
Sure. If the heart rate is, say, 130, but the fever is low grade or even absent, it points to myocardial dysfunction. It's not just a simple febrile response.
You're actually seeing pump failure in real time.
Precisely.
There's another clinical pearl here that feels a bit counterintuitive. The fluid paradox.
This is where mistakes can happen. You have a patient who looks septic. The standard protocol says give intravenous fluids.
So you push the bolus. And what happens?
They deteriorate.
Because the pump is already compromised.
Right. You have to suspect myocarditis or cardiogenic shock immediately. You can't just assume it's distributive shock.
And that distinction saves lives. Now, what about the ECG? It lies to us.
It shows persistent ST segment elevations. But here's the key. They don't follow a typical vascular... Exactly. A typical vascular territory.
So it looks just like an OMI.
A perfect mimic of an occlusion myocardial infarction.
But then the angiogram will be clean.
Clean coronaries with elevated markers, and that is your pivot point.
We need to look at the tissue structure itself. We see aneurysms in myocarditis, But they're different from post-infarction aneurysms.
Very different. Post-infarction is transmural. These myocarditis aneurysms, they result from focal inflammatory fibrosis.
So it creates a weak spot in the wall.
A focal weakening and ballooning of the wall, yes.
And what's the immediate risk of that ballooning?
Left ventricular thrombus formation.
Right, blood stasis in that little pocket.
Which means you have to anticoagulate.
So systemic anticoagulation is mandatory.
You have to prevent a stroke, absolutely.
Okay, let's move to diagnostic evaluation. We need proof. Start with biomarkers.
Well, high-sensitivity troponins are nearly universal.
What if the troponin is normal?
Then you should be very, very skeptical of the diagnosis.
And BMP.
That quantifies the severity of the failure.
Okay, what about CKMB?
Its utility is pretty variable. I'd say stick to troponin.
Imaging is the next step. What's the non-invasive tool of choice?
Cardiovascular magnetic resonance, CMR.
And we're looking for two specific things.
Myocardial edema and late gadolinium enhancement, LGE.
LGE isn't just a pretty picture, it's a predictor. Give me the statistic on that.
A 10% increase in LGE volume correlates with a 79% increase in adverse cardiovascular events.
Because that scar tissue becomes the substrate for arrhythmia.
It is the single strongest predictor we have on imaging.
Sometimes pictures aren't enough, though. When do we need to go invasive with an endomyocardial biopsy?
It's the gold standard, and it's really essential in high-risk patients.
We're basically doing this to rule out the killers.
To differentiate the lymphocytic form from giant cell or eosinophilic forms?
Because the treatment plan diverges pretty radically.
Completely different therapeutic paths. It's mandatory.
Okay, let's walk down those paths. Management protocols. Start with Tier 1.
That's supportive care. So oxygen, diuretics for congestion, vasodilators.
This is for the patient who is, for now, hemodynamically holding on.
Stable patients, yes.
Tier 2. The patient is sliding into cardiogenic shock. What do we reach for?
Inotropic agents. Dobutamine, norepinephrine.
And if the drugs fail?
Mechanical circulatory support, things like VA ECMO or an IABP.
So the goal here is just time.
It's a bridge to recovery or a bridge to transplant.
Tier 3. This is etiology specific. This is where that biopsy really pays off. When are corticosteroids vital?
For giant cell myocarditis, eosinophilic myocarditis, and immune checkpoint inhibitor-induced myocarditis.
But for the most common form, lymphocytic.
No, that's actually under evaluation right now in the METHES trial.
They're testing high-dose methylprednisolone.
They are, but until that data comes out, it is not the standard of care.
There was also some hope for anakinra, the interleukin-1 receptor antagonist.
There was, but the ERMIS study pretty much closed that door.
What was the finding?
No benefit. It didn't reduce heart failure or arrhythmias.
So we don't use it. What about antivirals?
Well, interferon alpha or ribavirin might be considered in the acute viral phases.
But often by the time they present, the viral load is already dropping.
Right, and the immune storm is just getting started.
Let's look at the long game. Prognosis and follow-up. What really defines the trajectory for these patients?
Two things. The degree of residual myocardial scarring and the presence of genetic predispositions.
We mentioned hemodynamic instability earlier. If a patient crashes early on, what are their odds?
It's about a 28% risk of death or transplant at 60 days.
That's nearly 1 in 3.
It is a high mortality event, no question.
And genetics seem to play a massive role here, maybe more than we used to realize. What percentage of cases involve pathogenic variants?
It's a wide range, but somewhere between 4 and 44%.
That's potentially almost half. Which genes are we talking about?
Primarily desmosomal or sarcolemal genes.
The structural glue of the heart cells.
Exactly. If the glue is defective, the heart just can't handle stress.
Which explains the very strict activity recommendations. Can they go for a run?
Absolutely not. Exercise restriction is mandatory during the acute phase.
We're trying to prevent sudden death.
You're minimizing the risk of sudden cardiac death on an already compromised substrate.
How often does this disease end up in a transplant?
It accounts for about 0.7% of all heart transplants.
But if we narrow that down to just non-ischemic cardiomyopathy transplants?
Then the number jumps up to 16%.
Let's circle back to that fluid paradox. I want to make sure this point really sticks. Why do we call it a paradox?
Well, in sepsis, or distributive shock, the tank is empty, you fill it, and the hemodynamics improve.
Right. But in myocarditis?
The tank is full, but the pump is broken. So when you add volume, you just increase the wall stress.
And the patient crashes.
They drown.
So if you have a septic-looking patient who gets worse with fluids...
Stop the fluids. and check the heart.
Okay, let's look at that giant cell again. 62.5% mortality or transplant in 60 days.
Yes.
That implies a very, very narrow window for diagnosis. You can't just wait and see.
You cannot wait for natural recovery. You have to biopsy. You have to treat aggressively with immunosuppression.
If you miss that biopsy window,
the patient likely dies.
Let's go back to the LGE, the late gadolinium enhancement. Can you explain the physics of what we're actually seeing there?
Sure. It represents fibrosis and expanded extracellular space.
It's basically dead space.
It's scar tissue.
And electrically, that scar is a roadmap for re-entry circuits.
Exactly. And that's why just a 10% increase in volume nearly doubles the adverse event risk.
Does that LGE ever resolve?
The inflammation, the edema, that can resolve. But the fibrosis, that's permanent.
So the MRI isn't a one-time test?
No. You should repeat the CMR to assess the resolution of that inflammation versus what's now permanent fibrosis.
Let's recap the 3 things clinicians really need to remember. Number 1.
The fluid paradox. Fluids make them worse.
Number 2.
The differential diagnosis. You have to know if it's giant cell. You must know.
Number 3.
The red flag. Tachycardia out of proportion to fever.
And I'm going to add a 4th.
Go ahead.
Genetics.
4 to 44%.
Which brings us to our final thought for the day.
It does.
With up to 44% of these cases involving genetic variants, we have to ask a pretty hard question.
Are we failing the families?
Exactly. Are we under-testing the families of myocarditis patients?
Are we just labeling it bad luck when it's actually bad genes?
Because if we find the gene, we can protect the family.
We can screen them. We can intervene early.
But only if we look.
The science says we should be looking.
That's our time. Stay curious.
Stay sharp.